Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Collegio Fratelli Cairoli. We are going to start in less than 5 minutes, so you're welcome to take a seat. Buonasera a tutti, l'evento inizierà a breve, entro qualche minuto. Vi preghiamo di sedervi, grazie. Buongiorno a tutti, benvenuti. 2 rapidissime parole in italiano per iniziare. Saluto e ringrazio tutti quelli che ci ascoltano, sia qui nell'aula magna del Collegio Cairoli che a distanza. Per me è un'enorme emozione, che è stata anche la mia casa per 6 anni. Ringrazio anzitutto il rettore del collegio, il professor Zatti, e tutta l'organizzazione, ma anche il Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche e Sociali dell'Università di Pavia, con cui quest'anno, come alcuni sapranno, il collegio ha avviato una speciale collaborazione e del quale Francesco è docente, mentre Michele, come anche me d'altronde, ha avviato i suoi studi universitari nelle aule proprio di questo dipartimento. Quello di oggi è un appuntamento del ciclo Orizzonti, scenari, prospettive e sfide nel campo della politica internazionale. Si tratta di una rassegna di incontri su temi legati agli affari internazionali osservati da vari punti di vista. Vi invito come sempre a seguire gli aggiornamenti sui prossimi eventi di questo ciclo, che prosegue per tutto il corso dell'anno accademico e che vedrà già nel mese di aprile un nuovo evento che coinvolge un prestigioso ospite internazionale che annunceremo a breve. Un prestigioso ospite istituzionale, scusatemi, italiano ed istituzionale. I now switch to English, so good afternoon everybody, both online and in presence, and welcome to the Aula Magna of the Collegio Cairoli. Besides my alma mater, the University of Pavia, the Social and Political Studies Department, and the whole Collegio Cairoli organization that I have already thanked in Italian, I would like to thank also the WPIR community, both professors and students who showed up in large numbers today. This English language highly international degree program closely follows issues such as the ones we are going to investigate today and attracts students from the Balkans as well as from Middle Eastern and Asian countries. I will now briefly present today's guest speakers. Michele Benazzo is currently completing a PhD in international history and politics at the Geneva Graduate Institute in Switzerland, with a thesis titled The Forgotten Generation, British Muslim Foreign Fighting in the Bosnian Civil War, 1981-1995. He holds a bachelor degree in political science and international relations from the University of Pavia and a master's degree in international politics and diplomacy from the University of Padova. He also obtained a specialized master's degree in terrorism and political violence at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland. His main research interest is the interplay between migration, integration, and political violence, as he intersects history and international relations to explain transnational violence, and specifically European Muslim foreign fighting. He conducts research in fields as history of political violence, radicalism, Islamism, race relations, migration. He has academic publications and He presented conference papers on these issues in multiple countries. Mr. Professor Francesco Mazzucotelli has been teaching Middle East and post-Ottoman space-related issues in a variety of settings, including academic, to both graduate and undergraduate students, and non-academic ones, such as business community and human resources management. He currently teaches history of Turkey and the Middle East at the University of Pavia. He holds a PhD in political institutions from Milan's Catholic University and has previously studied at the American University of Beirut. His fields of research cover areas such as identity processes, politicization of ethnic and confessional identities, and the role of the urban spaces and urbanization processes in political and social marginalization. He studies these issues within a historical, anthropological, and sociological framework. As you all know, this conference, which will actually be more of a talk between me and our two guests rather than a traditional lecture, will be followed by a question time for both online and in-presence audience. Today, we are going to investigate the phenomenon of European foreign fighters. The birth of European foreign fighters is often incorrectly related to ISIS and to the Bataclan terrorist strikes, which took place in Paris between 2014 and 2015. In fact, such phenomenon originated within the context of the Bosnian War. This war had a crucial impact on the subsequent evolution of foreign fighting. It is on the Balkan battlegrounds that European foreign fighters first came into contact with ideological elements influenced by Al-Qaeda and its specific jihadist narrative. After providing some insights on jihadism as an ideology, as well as on foreign fighters and their activities, we will show how the war in Bosnia was the moment when several different jihadist movements came into contact with each other, dramatically shaping the birth of the phenomenon of foreign fighters. While Mr. Professor Mazzucotelli will help us understand the multi-phased context of Bosnia and the historical events related to the Bosnian Civil War, as well as to Islamism and the jihadist ideology, Mr. Professor Benazzo will outline the often overlooked relationship between this war and the phenomenon of European foreign fighters. I would like to conclude my short speech with the wish that this event might contribute to arouse more interest for these issues for both the public and university staff. This talk will hopefully also be an example of how several historical phenomena have roots and origins that are far more complex and go farther back in history than one might think at a first glance. So thank you and enjoy the talk. Okay, so I will just address my first question to Francesco here to my right, and I would ask him to provide us some background on the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina during the mid-90s and about, especially about, of course, the 1992-1995 Bosnian War.
Okay, thank you, Filippo. Thank you very much. Good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. Many thanks to Professor Zatti, to Filippo, and all those who've organized and are managing this event. And many thanks. It's a pleasure to share the table with you, Michele. You're doing a really good job on a very delicate but compelling issue. So it's a pleasure to see you again and discuss these topics. Now, talking about Bosnia and the Balkans in Collegio Germanico-Ungarico is a little overbearing. It reminds a little bit of Sarajevo and Franz Ferdinand. But this is not just an attention-catching line, because one of the main points is really what the Muslim identity means in the context of Bosnia and the Balkans. Now, we're not going to have a history lesson because the main speaker is Michele, and he has a lot of things to explain about the phenomenon of foreign fighting in the region. But just to address your point, one of the main topics is exactly the definition of a Muslim identity in the Bosnian context through the years of war. Now we have here some titles, some books in the background that helps to a little bit frame our discussion. Maybe Michele will get into some more details about these publications later on. The phenomenon of, let's say, jihadism, foreign fighting in the Bosnian Civil War on the Muslim side is not as researched as it might seem at a first glance. So we've seen behind us some publications. A few of them are good scholarly works based on interviews, based on the selected few data that are available for analysis. Other books are, you know, very bad scholarships that is full of Islamophobic tropes and assumptions on, you know, Islamic invasion and demographic threat and so on. Let's get back to Collegio Germanico Ungarico and 1914, because, well, one of the main points of the Austro-Hungarian rule after Bosnia was seized from the Ottoman rule to the Habsburg Empire in 1878 was exactly the idea of building up a shared Bosnian identity with no ethnic or religious affiliations attached to it. And this Habsburg fostered idea of a common Bosnian identity largely didn't work because several centuries of Ottoman rule before had consolidated what in scholarship is defined as the millet system. So the idea of having very strong religious affiliation as the basis of communal identity. People tended, well, there was no strict segregation, but people tended to live in different neighborhoods, and religious affiliation among Orthodox Christians, Catholics, and Muslim was the basis of local identity. So to make this long story short and get back to the point, many of the existing Ottoman institutions were preserved during the Austro-Hungarian rule after 1878 and after 1908, and many institutions were preserved under the Yugoslav kingdom after the First World War. And even though the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia was ruled by a party called the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, national, ethnic, and religious identities and institutions were preserved even after the Second World War. Communism, I am no expert, so I don't want to get into details that are not exactly my field of expertise, but communism in Yugoslavia was a very peculiar thing, where in many instances, nationalism, ethnic nationalism, and communal identities were preserved and were part of the formula. It's not correct to make a complete comparison, but the kind of national territorial ethnic federalism that was established in Soviet Union was in many ways resounding with what happened in Yugoslavia after the end of the Second World War. So it was a federative republic, but this model of federalism was ethnic and nationally based, with constituent republics, each of which was given to a titular nation. In the context of Soviet Union, that was called Titulnaya nacija, or titular nation. But in the case of Yugoslavia, these were called narod, or nations, and each republic had this sort of priority nation: Slovenes in Slovenia, Croats in Croatia, Montenegrins in Montenegro, and so on. There was a system to address the question of national minorities and non-Slavic nationalities. But basically, there was the idea of having a sort of priority group in each constituent republic. Now, the question was, what about Bosnia? Who was the constituent republic or the titular nation in this federal republic? It was pretty clear. We have Serbians in Serbia, Croats in Croatia, Slovenes in Slovenia, but what about Bosnia, where even the Austro-Hungarians fail in creating a sort of Bosnian shared nationality? Now, with all this discussion about communism, Tito and the authorities of the Yugoslav state resorted to the creation of a concept called Muslims by nationality, or Muslimani. So there was this idea that being Muslim was an ethnic, a national question more than a religious one. And many people identified as Muslim along lines that were mainly ethnic and national. So you could go to the mosque, you could profess a religious lifestyle or not, you could drink rakia or not, but this was not the point. The point was having this sort of general cultural background that identified where you chose to identify as Muslim by nationality. Now, arguably, what happened with the civil war in the 1990s and afterwards is not just a war between different nationalities on who had this sort of priority in the independent state of Bosnia. It was also an internal conflict on how to redefine the idea of being Muslim in Bosnia, whether it should be a state of Muslims, but not necessarily an Islamic one based on Sharia, or whether it should be a Muslim state in the sense of being Sharia compliant and Islamically defined. I understand this looks like, very abstract, but when we look at these references behind, this is clearly explained. So especially the third, not this one, this one, Marco Hoare, who is partly British, partly Croatian, but works at the Bosnian Institute in London. What he explains is how Bosnia armed was mainly defined by the idea of building up a nation state for Muslims, an independent state, where those Muslims would be the majority, but not necessarily, not really Islamic state. Other people, and perhaps those we will discuss tonight, had a different idea, which was not just creating from the dissolution, from the breakup of Yugoslavia, not just creating a state where Muslim might be the majority, the demographic majority, but creating a sort of Islamic state in the lines of the Islamical radical thought that was circulating in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Then we have some maps here, but I don't think we need to get into the details because this is probably what we're going to say. Perhaps we can go back later on these details. How you build up a nation state in the ethnic and religious map we just saw behind is a sort of tricky question where you draw the borders, who are the leading elites in this state. These were all tricky questions. Now, as an attempt to answer your question and move on to further points, I think, basing my considerations on this literature, that one of the main points was exactly this shift on how to redefine a Muslim identity in this context. With the failure of this federative state and the emergence of a very aggressive nationalism everywhere in the region.
Thank you very much, Francesco. I believe you draw a very clear picture of how of the situation in Bosnia since the Ottoman rule just until recent times. So addressing now a question to Michele, I would like you to answer very quickly to this question. So how are Muslim communities developing while war was ravaging in Bosnia? How were Muslim communities in Europe developing? Why have we been witnessing Muslim migration to Europe since probably the 1950s, but Islamism has just grown more recently, let's say just since the 90s?
It works. Good. Yeah, actually, Francesco made a very clear picture of, the Bosnian cosmopolitan background, which is truly a nightmare to understand. But today we are dealing with the notion of frame fighting, but frame fighters are essentially, if we have to take them at the very essence, they are essentially travelers. So people that move from one spot to another. And in this case, so along with the creation or alteration, design of a Muslim identity in Bosnia, we need also to basically do a little bit of pinpointing also to the case of Muslims in Europe, because yeah, Filippo is perfectly right. I mean, Muslim migration toward the European countries, toward the West, has indeed a very long tradition and history. Still, interestingly, we can see this upsurging of jihadi thought. Even though jihad is a very tricky notion, but still, there was a mobilization for Bosnia, and that was quite unprecedented. For instance, there were not that much of concern for everything related to Afghanistan, for instance, for the Afghan jihad. We, to a certain extent, could be similar to the Bosnian case. So why we have this difference in the trend? Well, I do think the need, we have to take a little bit a step back, maybe because both of us are historian by training. So we have a little bit the attention of looking back to see the present and maybe see the future. Well, after the Second World War, many Muslims, so basically people who came from Muslim countries, for instance, Pakistan, Bangladesh, certain areas of India, to some extent the Middle East, even though the Middle East is a bit retarded, delayed, that, let's say, timeline. Many moved to Europe, like we can witness nowadays for people from the Mediterranean or from Africa. And then during the 1960s and 1970s, the economic downturn globally, the poor or bad performance in the ex-colonies economies pushed more and more people to move, and many more family members in the end rejoined people who went there for economic reason. And so there was this, in the literature is named like the sort of sedentarism of Muslim community, from being, let's say, bypassers in Europe, meaning that they wanted just to gain and have some economic profit and then go back. To 1970s, there was a more and more present permanence in Europe, in England, in France, in the Netherlands, Germany, to some extent Italy too. And was like coming into a new state, to a certain extent they have to find a way to be part of this new environment. Let's say that they wanted to be still part of the political bargaining and to find their own spot in the end, And simply the point is that at the very beginning, the religious identity was not the primary mover, the primary concerns. But I mean, quite interestingly, it was more an identity or a radical identity to a certain extent, but it's not just compelling to the radical system. It's a very, society-wide phenomenon they perceive themselves as discriminated for their ethnic, or so in certain cases, in particular France and England, for being black. So there was really this idea of black identity, of racial identity beaming up from the background, and basically putting the Muslim
I'm pretty confident that much of you here remember about the Rushdie affair. So the satanic verses, for instance. There was also the Iraqi war that in the end was perceived by some Arab preachers as
those Islamic identities in Europe. And we actually have to think at the, because I mean, Muslim community in the West are by far not monolithic. I mean, a number of different issues, either in terms of religious thinking or religious affiliations or whatever. But the dominant fact, while the Bosnian war rose up and
simultaneously in Europe, Muslims
community underwent, we shall also name it as Muslimization or Islamization of identity.
And became attractive.
In that case, Bosnia became relevant and became attractive because the Islamic faith, Islamic issue was
on the threat,
at the very same time
Bosnia, but also
the threat either in Bosnia, but also to an extent in Europe too. And so potentially this reach was there.
Why before there was not? So there was this sort of simultaneous iteration that get back and forth from Europe to Bosnia, from the larger Muslim scenario, Muslim space,
I would say. I mean, I hope this answers your question.
Thank you very much. This was a very clear answer in my opinion. So now I will ask a question to both of you. Let's say a double question. So let's say a double question. So I would asking Francesco to draw for us a quick picture of Islamism is in the 21st century, as quick as it is possible to be. That's the point. Maybe a few minutes. And then I will straight away move to Michele, and I would ask Michele what is exactly foreign fighting is. The main differences between foreign fighting as a phenomenon and as a phenomenon, since Islamism can endorse both foreign fighting and terrorism, but those two concepts are actually quite different, even though someone has been using them as synonyms. So I would start by asking Francesco to deal with the picture of Islamism in the 21st century.
I'll try to do that. First of all, I think we need to clarify some terms and make some differences, because the history of political Islam is very complex, and trying to is very difficult because this is one of those empty signifiers that can mean everything and its opposite, depend what you put inside. Also, in the academia, we talk a lot about traveling theories. So political ideas do travel from one place to the other. When they travel, theories get translated, they get modified, they get adjusted and accommodated to the context. So what starts as Islamism in Afghanistan obviously is not the same as Indonesia or Bosnia, because I would say, of course, there's always some translation in the travel. And the interesting thing is to look at who are the translators, the transmitters of these theories, what's get lost in translation, who is adjusting, who is making these ideas relatable to the new political context. And that makes it a little more difficult to us to answer in general what is Islamism in the 21st century, but I'll try to, share some details. First of all, aspiring to have to build up an independent state for Muslims does not mean that you necessarily want an Islamic state. This, for example, was the case of Pakistan, which was founded as the nation state for the Muslims of the subcontinent, but it was not conceived originally as an Islamic state. It kind of became afterwards with the Islamization of the law, of the legal and the banking system. But that happened afterwards. Now, we can discuss for the rest of the night, as for the rest of the year, whether a nation state that is predicated on religious definitions of national identity would more or less inevitably to a religious state. And we can, discuss many examples, even outside the Muslim world, even with other religions and other nation states. When you have a definition of nation and nationality based on religious criteria, would that lead to a certain, intersection of religion and politics that might become problematic? This is a question that we might discuss forever and ever. So first of all, aspiring to the foundation of a state for Muslims in the case of Bosnia is not the same thing as wanting Islamic state. Political Islam in the second half of the 20th century is largely a response against capitalism and against communism. So it's in many ways the attempt at building a sort of third model that claims to be alternative to capitalism and liberal democracies on the one hand, and Marxism and communist regimes and communist systems to the other. There's a little bit of everything in political Islam, and I would urge to make a difference, because political Islam does not, or Islamism does not mean jihadism. You can have political Islam that, becomes a political party and is part of the election. You may like it or not. You may challenge their ideas or you support them, but it doesn't necessarily mean into jihadism, which is the legitimization of violence, of armed force as an instrument of politics. Now, I think we are all familiar with the names of the likes of Gilles Kepel or Olivier Roy, who have argued for years whether what comes first, the idea of political Islam or the idea or the assumption from the West of the legitimacy of violence as a tool for political challenges. After all, we've seen terrorism, we've seen the use of violence in radical, in contentious politics in Europe in the 1960s, in the 1970s, before the establishment of many jihadi groups in the Middle East and in North Africa. So the picture is more blurred and more complex than we would like to assume. And before I move on, and I leave the microphone to Michele. Also, jihadism and Salafiyya are not the same thing, because Salafism is a branch of Islam, is a method of relying, of approaching the sources, and it can take different paths. So you can have quietist Salafi that are maybe very strict about the interpretation of religious sources, but they do not engage in contentious politics, let alone armed struggle. You can have Salafi that participate in political life with political parties, but they do not advocate of force or violence as a legitimate means. And then you have Salafi jihadis or jihadis as whatever. And even in the case of jihadism, just take away my microphone if I'm taking too much time. Even in the case of jihadism, at the end of the 20th century, we have different authors based on different contexts and coming from different sources. Now, studies on formation of jihadi thought in the 1980s and early 1990s point to a peculiar mixture of sources and ingredients. We have radicalized Islamists that were chased from Egypt after, the assassination of Anwar al-Sadat as president of Egypt, after the oppression of Islamist parties in Egypt. We have radicalized Palestinian subjects from the experience of refugee camps, which doesn't mean that all Palestinians are jihadists. We have radicalized subjects in Saudi Arabia, and all of them have different backgrounds. They might reread authors like Said Qutb, for example, but it's really an assemblage, putting up pieces, putting up ingredients. And it's a complicated mixture, an assemblage of different ingredients of the puzzle. There's the radicalization of Islamism in Egypt. There's opposition to the Saudi kingdom in Saudi Arabia. And then there's the Afghan war, which is a sort of breeding ground and a sort of huge sort of greenhouse for the concoction of jihadi thought in the 1980s. And for example, we are traveling a little bit here. I hope this is not complicating unnecessarily, but a place like Peshawar, the background of the Afghan civil war, is really one of the places where all these pieces come together. And they start to mingle in this idea of a global jihad, where basically different conflicts around the world, whether it's Algeria or Somalia or Chechnya or Kashmir, and later on Bosnia or Palestine, are not seen as national conflicts. They are seen as different battlefields of a more global jihad. Again, all those who are deemed unbelievers, whether it's the West or Muslim governments that are not seen as sufficiently Islamic. So you asked about Islamism in the 21st century, but I think we have to start from what jihadism looked like at the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s. And it's a mixture of different sources that travels around the world in a very specific context, which is the historical context of the end of the Cold War, and a lot of conflicts that spread in North Africa because of the failure of some political systems, like the Algerian one, national conflicts connected to the dissolution, to the breakup of Yugoslavia and Soviet Union, or the power vacuum in strategically delicate areas like the Horn of Africa. And in all these cases, we have a failure of governments and state systems, and there's, groups can be sort in a way to fill up those power vacuums. And I think here we can move on to the specific causing examples.
Well, again, thank you for having pitched this extremely complex mosaic we have. Yeah. And yeah, just before kicking off with answering Filippo's question, just a reminder, I mean, these are very difficult and complex notions, concepts and phenomena for us too. So please, whatever you feel free or you feel that you want to get back to us with any question afterward, because these are truly sensitive topics that actually touch us in our daily routine, I think. Just get back to us afterwards in hoping for some clarifications. Because in the end, what we have to start with is that Islamic does not mean Islamism, and Islamist does not mean jihadism. It has completely different forms and completely different way of thinking on the topic. But when it comes to battleground and battlefield, just opposing one, you can actually have all of them playing out, and some reinforcing each other, some contrasting each other. And could you give me my slide?
Yeah, sure.
Right, just to help them out. So the point is that the jihadi battleground actually saw a number of type of violence that could actually rise up. And we have this idea, particularly in Western Europe, that foreign fightings mean terrorism, which is not absolutely true. And the motivation of that is that we basically discovered foreign fighting by means of terrorism, by the Bataclan attacks, by the case in Brussels, or still by all these, very complex environments related to the post 9/11 era, which for us in West, everything that was related to Islamism, and in a certain period, I would say also Islamic, was terrorism or jihadism, which is not true. So first of all, I think we have to make a little clarification of what is foreign fighting and what is not. Of course, foreign fighting is an act of violence. It means fight. But we can say that is a bit caught in between mercenaries and we could say terrorism. A mercenary is someone that is motivated by profit. So is a profit gainer. Is a figure that has been existing in the history of Europe, or maybe the world history, since the very beginning, most likely. But it's completely different from foreign fighting and also from terrorism, because it's in the end a very criminal violence. Foreign fighters and terrorists are not motivated by profit, are moving their expertise and skills for political change, for any personal political motivations. Actually, also the UN Security Council has to face a threat and to conceptualize to a certain extent foreign fighting after the Syrian civil war and ISIS. And again, as you can see from the definitions, in the end, foreign fighters ended up being related to terrorist acts. Now, it is the case that some foreign fighters ended up being in a loop of terrorism, but it's not always as such. There are many cases of foreign fighting in which in the end terrorism was not endorsed at all. And maybe since we are in the West, I would say, and I assume most likely we are quite aware of our own past in Europe. We had cases of foreign fighting in European history too, also quite recently. Next slide. Thank you. For instance, the Spanish Civil War. I mean, in the Spanish Civil War, there were tons of people that fled also from Italy too, that basically joined the battle for personal or rather political motivation. At that time, it was the tyranny against democracy, totalitarianism against freedom. None of these actually get involved in terrorism after their return, at least to our knowledge. Or, for instance, we could actually see that, you know, one of the best and most renowned poets in European literature in England, or Britain, Lord Byron, was technically a foreign fighter too, because he left to join the battles in Italy and then in Greece. And he openly declared that, and he died in Greece too. And nobody referred to him as any foreign fighter or terrorist. But if we want to stretch, there are also those that say that one of our, you know, founding father of Italy, Garibaldi, in the end was a foreign fighter to a certain stretch of time. So the point here is that foreign fighters are, to a certain extent, a sort of a conundrum, a riddle, a figure in between many conceptual layers that could actually speak to all of them, because it's true that some foreign fighters did terrorist acts, some did not, some in the end get back home, some other died in the battlefield. And again, there is no monolithic view of why people actually went fighting as foreign fighters. The way, for instance, the Spanish Civil War was something related to tyranny versus democracy. But there are many others that fled, for instance, from the US and from Western countries during the Israelo-Palestinian War at the end of the 1940s to fight for what would have become later on the State of Israel. So in the end, if we have to be very conservative and try to give a very neutral definition, in the end, the foreign fighters is a citizens of a country which is not involved in a specific battle, and in the end, join this battle. So, as happened, for instance, with maybe Italians that went to fight with the Kurds, for instance, in Turkey, or with French that went on fighting, in the Syrian civil war, but did not ended up joining ISIS. But actually, this picture is even more complicated, because if we reflect very carefully, potentially any act of violence, of political violence, in the eyes of the perpetrators, either foreign fighters, terrorists, or a member of the army, is an act of solidarity. He's doing that for someone else, or to defend someone, or because he believes in a meaning, a notion that could be beneficial to others after him. And so, in here, the work of Nina really quite enlightening, honestly, is an extreme manifestation of solidarity for him, because in the end, it means that a foreign fighter is capable of putting himself in danger for someone else who basically does not partake in the same nationality, which is something that does not actually speak the language of the nation state, or this is not something we are kind of accustomed to, because we tend to think of this army as national army, like the compulsory draft or being part of the army. Foreign fighters basically think differently and trespass, go beyond the idea of, fighting for my own nation, because they see themselves as part of another nation. In this case, Islamists can play the part, but people maybe are from England, but they fought for their co-religionists because they were Muslims, not because they were British, for instance. And so the point, and here we come to Bosnia, is that, the Bosnian War was a total moment of calling for solidarity in West or in the global scenario. I mean, at that time, there was, next slide. At that time, I mean, the word of, I decided to put the quotation from Waiti Solo, who was a Spanish journalist and writer. The Bosnian War was an absolute disaster on a humanitarian side, because for many reasons that to a certain extent are quite reflecting the case of Ukraine now, if this might be more helpful to give the grand narrative. Because there was a moment in which nobody was actually decisively involved. Nobody wanted to defend actually or get involved in the Bosnian nightmare. And I mean, the word genocide and comparison with Israel concentration camps were quite normal practice in that moment in Western Europe, in Italy too. And what actually did not come out from part of the states or for the European community or the United Nations, actually the civil society took the part. I mean, there were tons of solidarity workers, aid workers, NGOs that were born in the Bosnian case. And among them, there were many left as aid workers and in the end ended up being foreign fighters. And this is kind of disturbing, I would say, to us, because it means that we have somehow to accept the deal that something that normally we do not associate with violence, such as solidarity, in the end can, in certain scenario, become violence also. And that was the perfect picture for Bosnia and for the Muslims community in the West, that in the early phases, in the end, did their part very, I would say also bravely. I'm not referring to foreign fighters only, but also to, again, solidarity workers. In all this complex mist, there was violence, there were foreign fighters that came genuinely in defense. And just to conclude, I think that possibly the best example of how in the end foreign fighting is a very complex and variegated notion. There were no attacks or terrorist attacks recorded by those who went fighting in Bosnia and then get back or did not get back, but there were no terrorist fights afterwards. So to a certain extent, that was a very good case of how political violence can shape and reshape itself in the very same scenario, I would say.
Thank you very much, Michele. I will now ask a further question to you, and I would ask to assess for us the impact of the Bosnian War on later developments of jihadism in Europe, as Bosnia represented kind of a crossroads between Afghans and North African and European jihadism and European foreign fighters. So yeah, if you could please elaborate on this point.
At least we can attempt. Can you give me the next?
Sure.
Next slide? Thank you. So basically, this is from where we can title this conference. So Jihad at a Crossroads, because Bosnia really was, to a certain extent, a very weird meeting points of different streams of Islamism and jihadism. Here we can say that from a number of places. There were at least 3 big waves of Islamism that mixed, met, changed itself in Bosnia. One were the one came from the Afghan scenario. So the Afghan war against the Soviet, after the Soviet invasion. And basically, we could say that stopped in 1989, not ended, but stopped in 1989. And there were a number of fighters that literally flocked from the Middle East in particular and the Gulf, and some from North Africa too, and were there. When the Bosnian Civil War broke out, there was this massive movement from the East, so from Afghanistan to Bosnia. There was also second streams that was more related to the experience in the north part of Africa, Egypt. The Algerian Civil War was ravaging, while in the Balkans, Bosnia exploded. And the Algerian Egyptians found in the Bosnian battleground the perfect ecosystem for surviving, because they were completely, reasonably to a certain extent also, they were under the pressure of the Algerian and the Egyptian states, and some of them basically moved, or consciously, or because they were literally sent by some leaders, local leaders, to fight in Bosnia, to develop connections. And then there was the third one, the newest one, I would say, from Europe, because in the meantime, Muslims in Europe underwent this progressive Islamization we addressed in the first question Filippo asked. So we could say that Bosnia was this spot in the world where three different trends found their best meeting points. And actually, that was true. I mean, Francesco was very right since the beginning. I mean, the Bosnian Civil War for the study of Islam has not been very much considered. And the case is that if you see on the right-hand side of the slide, I mean, this book has not been translated. It's just in Serbo-Croat and or in Bosnian to understand. But it was actually the only, the journalist interviewed many of the foreign fighters that were there. And I mean, I quoted, I translated and quoted a part of it. You can see that there were British, actually Britons who came from Jamaica, British from Turkey, Saudi, some Algerians. The ward was there, to the point that in the very same Bosnian army, there was a brigade, 7th Muslim Brigade, in which part of these foreign fighters ended up fighting. The point is that all these three different streams, for what Francesco very clearly pictured us, came from very different scenarios. The Afghan jihad, in the end, was not actually prone automatically to terrorism. So Al-Qaeda and this way of thinking did not originate purely in Afghanistan. It was something that came up a bit later on. And so there were foreign fighters, genuine foreign fighters from the Arab world, who did not actually match that much with terrorism. There were the Europeans that had a very, very basic notion of Islamism, and no clues at that moment of open international jihad was there. So it is a bit of concern, but we can be quite safe in saying that there was a genuine spirit of solidarity from those who left, also because many were actually converted in the 1980s under this Islamization going on. And after there were the Algerian and the Egyptians. And there were exactly where the most violent, brutal, gruesome way of thinking jihad came out. Could you give me the next slide? And two things actually occurred. So the question now is how Bosnia managed to energize one way of thinking jihad over others. And I mean, this is open to debate, honestly. But in my mind, there were at least two things that allowed this more brutal Egyptian, Algerian style of thinking jihad to thrive, nurture, and outgrow in the Bosnian battlefield. The first one were the fact that in the end, again, nobody was helping Muslims, not even Muslim states. So the Muslim community at large saw some states, in particular Saudi Arabia in that moment, some Pakistan actually, also like Egypt to a certain extent too, but nobody was there. The help from Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Iran came quite late, like at the end of 1993, so midway through. And so the largest Muslim community lost their feeling or their expectation. In other words, there were no rulers that could actually be the defender of Islam. And so what happened is that in this political vacuum that Francesco describes, basically people, some preachers, took the power in their own hands. So they acted as surrogates for states in the end. And as you can see, the word kafir is a notion that pertains, I mean, it's an Islamic notion too, but has a central role in Islamism or in this political vision of Islam, but has a very, very neat and crucial notion in the jihadism, the way of Qaeda for that. So we could say Salafi jihadism. In the way that it has been interpreted since from the Algerians, the Egyptians, and then all these streams ended up being Al-Qaeda, there was a sort of popular takfirism. So basically, everybody, all those who did not defend, were passible of being targeted by jihad. Normally, jihad is the classic notion, has very rigid rules. It's not terrorism. There was some prescription to be sought. With takfirism, and because there were no states ready to take the arms, basically everybody was passible of being targeted by jihad. We trespassed this notion because there was not the authority from part of the state that was ready to take up the burden. And the second one, which I decided to put up in the cover of the book of Hikmet Karcic, the violence that was in Bosnia was absolutely terrible. I mean, the Serbian camps, as well as the torture that were in the streets, resembled quite close all these violent practices that in the end were afterward present in Al-Qaeda. For instance, hostage taking is not something that classic notion of jihad endorses. Beheading, neither. Rape, neither. All these forms of violence were present in the Bosnian battle. So we could say, potentially, that two forms of violence spoke to each other or maybe influenced each other. The genocidal way of managing violence by Serbs, Croats, and basically whoever was passing in Bosnia in that moment gave the open door to reshape this violence in an Islamist way, in a jihadi way. So just to conclude and answer your question, I don't think that Bosnia as such gave a spark to the nucleus of Al-Qaeda, because many of those who fought in Bosnia either remained in Bosnia or went on fighting in other battlefields. There was some in the end ended up being part of the nucleus, original nucleus of Al-Qaeda. But what Bosnia gave was the perfect picture or the right ecosystem to make, I would say, jihadists to make this jump forwards or backward according to the needs. And let's say that international jihadists in the Al-Qaeda side basically outsized all the other, became, the beacon that could actually speak for the needs, while all the other ideologies and way of thinking jihad in the end failed.
May I add one consideration here? Because what Michele described as mobility, the guy from Jamaica and the other has Algerian background, was raised as French, and the other from. This might seem bizarre, but it's not. When Bernard Rouget is a student of Gilles Kepel, writes Le Jihad quotidien, everyday jihad, in the English translation, through his field work, that is not based on Bosnia, that is based on the Middle East and another context, but is still showing these stories of mobility, of people from very different backgrounds, and you see them for a while in Lebanon, then they go fighting in Bosnia, in Chechnya, and then they appear somewhere in the backlines of the Afghan war. So these stories of physical mobility are there and are important, and you do not need to have thousands of people. This is probably one of the main points that need to be explored further, because we might stop at the quantitative analysis and say, oh, well, it was 600 people, so it's not that much. I think this is a wrong approach, because when we are dealing with these formations, with these kind of very, very radicalized, you don't need to have huge numbers. As I pointed before, you don't need a critical mass for these traveling theories. Just need to have these selected few hundreds, and they're doing the job. Another point which emerged from your analysis, and I think is an important one, is mirror effect. So the violence that happens in Algeria is mirrored by other practices. You see something happening in Algeria, which was also very violent, and this is replicated. Chechnya was very violent. Not entering, I'm not adding anything, but Chechnya is very violent, and there's this kind of mirror effect where you end up emulating and imitating practices of violence, as you showed just now. And lastly, when you were talking, I was thinking the point that is in Darryl book, the very first slide we have. Yeah, the universal canon. When the author is talking about jihad and empire, and again we can see the subline, the challenge of solidarity, which brings up to the point that you made before. The idea that you're bringing some sort of support, ideological and political support to the fight. But what Darryl shows in this book, which is basically the idea of involvement in the Balkan War, because there's a sort of fighting against the general international system, is also this, I think, very peculiar point of jihadism that we might discuss, which is its transformative, apocalyptic, salvationist narrative. This idea that, as sick as it might seem to our ears and eyes, this violence is seen as somehow redeeming the world. And there's this very apocalyptic language that we then find in Al-Qaeda and in a different thing called ISIS, where this idea of apocalyptic violence is tied to also this salvationist language and this idea of redemption, sort of catharsis, redemption through violence. It's problematic, it's difficult, but it's a very, very strong point. And, you know, the kind of violence that you show at the end, you know, some way claimed back.
Yeah.
But it's reinterpreted and reenacted as force of change.
Yeah.
And we might completely dislike the language, but it's a very powerful narrative, especially when it targets those subjects that for different reasons, and I do not want to make like cheap psychology here, but those profiles that are very potentially receptive to this kind of languages and imaginaries.
Thank you very much. I would just address one final question to Francesco, if you could, okay, to the winner of this challenge, and then if you could just reply very quickly and try and assess the role of Bosnia in post 9/11 Islamism, if this is possible to be done in like 5 minutes or so before leaving the floor to our guests who would like to pose questions to you.
I fly over, so keep it short. The role of Bosnia. I think that Bosnia has been vastly misinterpreted since the last 4 years, because normally the large part of the literature, historiography, political scientists, ethnographers, whatever, basically were concerned about Bosnia and the impact on the new world order, you know, or humanitarian interventions, or genocide, even though again, genocide is a quite problematic notion, but still, Islamism, jihadism, frame fighting was by far out of the picture since 9/11. I mean, after 9/11, so all of a sudden, I mean, most of the works you mentioned were basically right immediately between, if I recall correctly, between 2004, 2007, something like that. And all of a sudden, there we have terrorism, which is not exactly true, as we hope Francesco and me try to powerfully pitch to you. But it's true that in the end, if you follow the life trajectories of single individuals, Bosnia was not that relevant for the European or Western scenario. Again, because most of people that were there, either they died, either they decided to remain in Bosnia, or either went to the Afghanistan after 1995, where there was a civil war with the Taliban raging on. Actually, we have just one case of what in the end became the personal bodyguard of Bin Laden that actually fought in Bosnia, but is kind of exceptional. I think the role of Bosnia was intimately ideologized and politicized. That became the master stage where either the West, either Europe, either the Muslim states, not the Islamic state, the Muslim states failed. It was a completely reversal of the, I mean, if we stretch it, we could say that there was in that moment a completely reversal of power, of political power for a very brief time, in which civil society and FARC basically acted as surrogates of the international system for those about Bosnia, not for many other centers in the world, but for Bosnia, yes. And this basically fed all the narratives of post-Bosnian thinkers and also youth. In the end, you know, foreign fighters are not, and terrorists by far are not great masterminds or highly developed, skilled intellectual. Normally in the war scenario, foreign fighters are cannon fodder. Those, you just need the numbers you want to have foreign fighters. But for them, the way in which Islamist thinkers, some of them, reframe Bosnia. As Francesco said, this ideology migrated and that became relevant. That I honestly think that, because I should reflect on that, but I can also, being quite conservative, and say that since the end of the Cold War, Bosnia was the worst failure of the West in terms of the way in which they wanted to manage the new war. And just to conclude, two things actually stand out with the case of Bosnia. First, when Bosnia erupted, mass media were there. I mean, the Bosnian genocide, quote unquote, was the very first genocide that was streamed and broadcasted around the world. That never happened before, even though genocidal victims were already present. Vietnam was a genocide, Khmer Rouge, Cambodia again. Actually, we didn't know that much, but Bosnia the West was aware of that. And so there was this relative deprivation, say, of how the West should have done and did not. And second, again, you know, at the beginning of the 1990s, the whole international system became inspired profoundly by the notion of human rights. That was something that was not that much present before. It was present, but was not the grand scenario. The grand scenario were Cold War, superpowers, empire, anti-imperialism, not human rights. But human rights, when the Bosnian War broke out, was the narrative. And what was infringed in the end were human rights. The same human rights that in the end were the alleged cornerstone, the self-declared, you know, new inspiration for the new world order. And the whole West failed miserably, but failed miserably not only in not supporting the Bosnian scenario, but in the end, basically, the UN, the European community at the time, superpowers, basically had tried to depict themselves as the great paladin, the great defenders of human rights. And when it came on the need, there was nothing that could be done. And this basically reversed all the power relationship in that moment, which is not something that was, you know, far from sight. The Syrian civil war after was, to a certain extent, quite similar. Nowadays, Ukraine, even though it's not part of this conference, and I mean, I'm not entitled to speak for Ukraine because I'm not an expert in the area, but we can argue that that was, you know, the clicking moment.
Yeah, please.
No, I'm not adding a lot because you already very eloquently say so, but I think the answer is Bosnia was important as a causa célèbre. For one side, for the Islamophobic discourse in the West, because you have those books, I take responsibility for that, I call very bad books, the you know, sort of argue that, you know, the US shouldn't have helped the Bosnians or the Albanians in Kosovo because now we have the basis of caliphate in Europe and they are invading. It's, you know, the full equipment of Islamophobic tropes, plus a lot of domestic US politics in between. So you have something against Clinton or Obama. So everything is combined together. On the other side, I'm sorry for using other as them, but on the other side is a cause célèbre because, as Kira said before, he mentioned takfirism. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with this concept, but basically is the declaration declaring that someone is a sinner of apostasy. So not a true Muslim anymore, but what matters here is not theology or ethics, is the political meaning. Declaring that someone is kafir, claiming, or using takfir as a political device means you're denying their legitimacy to rule. So you are not just criticizing those governments of Muslim majority countries that allegedly or really did nothing to help, but you're claiming that they're not legitimate anymore. They do not have the legitimacy to rule over their countries and societies. That is a very political point. And, as Michele said, the whole story feeds into this, again, take responsibility for that, into this narration of abandonment. Yeah. So the Western countries abandoned us. They cannot be trusted because they didn't help those populations when they moved. So how can you trust them in the future? Because they do not step in where you need them. So there's this whole narrative of disillusionment and double standards and hypocrisy of the West that is running deep under the surface and is also feeding with multiple other ingredients and makes up a very explosive mix at the end. I think we can. You can want to ask something?
No. If they have answered their question.
Okay, so thank you very much for adding those insightful thoughts on the issue. And yeah, we have the time to get maybe one or maximum 2 questions from the public, if there are any. Okay, just 1 second.
Very much. Yeah, my question will be over. And I think just if you want to quantify people, before can you highlight live of scale numbers on percentage going, to conflict of conviction, because really wants to go with the cause. How is the percentage way of measuring who's going and this would be fields. How many of those foreign cities that they go on some foreign vacation? And then there also be other causes of
it's a tough question because you do not have many of the times you do not have reliable complete pictures, you do not have complete series of data. For example, speaking about, let's say, the Middle East, most of these data are collected ex post. How can you say that in English? Later on, when in the demobilization process. So by interviewing demobilized fighters, by doing interviews in Tripoli, Lebanon, for example, with four former fighters, you try to estimate the numbers through interviews or some documents post-demobilization, you try to get the picture. But of course, there's a lot of assumptions going there. So getting a full statistically reliable picture is at best educated guess. Your educated guess.
How many things go for war? How many go there and go out?
But if you, I'm taking perhaps an example that I know better. If you think about, you can also in this discussion, if you think at foreign fighters in Syria, from Kasserine, Tunisia, let's say 3,000 people.
3,000.
There's a little bit of everything, because you have young, disillusioned, unemployed or underemployed people in a very peripheral region of Tunisia. You have, you know, some exposure to radicalized preaching physically or through websites. You can, I mean, I wouldn't say that people, you know, okay, let's have a vacation, take to Syria. I would take out, you know, these extreme hypotheses. The mixture is very difficult to estimate because there's a sort of mixture. There's a mix of reasons. Taking, for example, those 3,000 from Tunisia to Syria. There's a little bit of showing off that you are a man and a fighter and not a passive victim and whatever. There's ideological conviction, there's economic reasons, and it's very difficult from the outside to determine precisely what is the main factor.
Very quickly, I can try to reply you with my own case, the case of Bosnia. I mean, Francesco is perfectly right. When we have to search about great fighters, there is always this, you know, sources related issues. That is, you know, interviews. Or first of all, you have to see if the guy survived, like basic stuff. But first, I do think that the mechanism related to not actually being exactly bombarded by propaganda, but being more, you know, sort of private, personal way of being a man. So actually that applied very, very well in the case of ISIS and afterwards, but for two main reasons. The first one is that, I mean, empirically speaking, those who went to Bosnia were much more than those who went, like in the case of ISIS, was for those few who went to Iraq, obviously. Second, the case of ISIS is very much related to a very wise use of social media, in which there is no way of filtering. That was extremely a sort of popularized notion of being a man. There are a couple of superbly researched books from in the French Academy on that, but did not actually work in the case of Bosnia because social media were not there, mass media were there, social media not. In my case, for the case of Bosnia also, there were a lot of ex-British Army members who basically converted in the end, and many who went as originally as foreign aid work. And so there was a sort of, we can assume that there was a genuine spirit. Some interviews were released, and it seems that there was this balancing of what Francesco said, a mixture of motivations. And this is also why many actually dropped in the last 4 years these streams of research, because in the end it was impossible to detect the precise motivation, also because you always start, you know, feeling the gut, or that basically people purposely omit some elements or tell you something else. Also,
read
or reread
legitimize.
again. So interviews are quite tricky. But in the case of Bosnia, at least in Britain and in France, in Italy was really different. I think that the best empirical element is that at that time, in France and in England, there were no Islamist preachers that actually endorsed a practical international form of jihad. There were a lot of political mobilization, for instance, Hizb ut-Tahrir, that was truly radicated in Britain, but Hizb ut-Tahrir was truly a party, an Islamist doctrine that, on the contrary, forbade the use of international violence because they needed to, close the rank and gain members that was locally present in Britain. So in the end, there was not that much Islamist propaganda, but there was a sort of genuine spirit that was suddenly and afterwards remanipulated in Bosnia. That I think it was bad. But it's true that afterwards, after 9/11, things changed a lot.
Thank you very much. We just have time for one very last question. We have one. If not, I just have to thank you all for being here, both online and in presence. And I hope to see you again for our next appointment in the month of April. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Sì.